welcome back. You've tuned into Liberated Voices. It is our 10th episode, so inshallah we've got a special lineup for you today. And before we begin, Ramadan Kareem. I am your host, Insia Fatima.
And I am your co-host, Hussein Abudar Ali Diakidiz. And today we'll be talking about the shifting politics or geopolitics of the Middle East with our guest, Dr. Saeed Khan. Saeed Khan is a lecturer at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, specializing in Islamic and Middle Eastern history.
And we are also joined by Kaneez Hisbani, who has a master's degree in international politics and human rights. She also works behind the scenes at Liberated Voices. So welcome to you both.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and I'd like to also wish everyone a Ramadan Mubarak, a Ramadan Kareem, as we embark on this very special and holy month.
Assalamu alaikum as well. Ramadan Mubarak as well, everyone.
Ramadan Mubarak, it's great to have you both on board.
So I think to start with, we have to look at the deal that's happened between Iran and Saudi, because I think this is, out of all the things that are going on right now in the Middle East and all these different countries that are talking to each other at the first, that haven't had relations for a long time, this is the one that's really at the center of everything, that's really pushing everything, because they're two regional giants, really. I'm just wondering what Saeed thinks of the deal and how it came about, because it's kind of a surprise. I'm not really certain myself what's happened.
You know, it's interesting. I was last week in Baku, Azerbaijan, when the reports came out, and I was struck by a few things. First and foremost, the fact, as you said, that it happened, and in the way that it happened, and who really brought the deal together, I think provided a big wow factor for so many of us. In the United States, I can tell you that the deal has really received very scant coverage. On the one hand, we could say that the reason for that is because the United States is obsessed with other things, whether it is Ukraine or the impending and perhaps imminent indictment and arrest of former President Donald Trump. But I think it's more than that. I would actually suggest that the absence of coverage is in part the same kind of bewilderment and surprise, catching a lot of people off guard. But also, I would suggest that it has a little bit to do with shame. I think that there is a colossal embarrassment and perhaps an acknowledgement of the receding American influence, not only in the Middle East, but perhaps more broadly on the global scale. The very idea that of all countries, China coming in, almost in the cloak of darkness, and being able to make this deal must have shocked quite a few people at the US State Department. Mostly, I would say, because there was the presumption that the Saudis would have perhaps leaked some of the information or would have notified or tipped off Washington that this was underway. But if you look at this deal, it was happening while the Saudis were also negotiating, if you will, with the United States and with possibly Israel. The big inquiry that was happening in Washington had to do with whether Saudi Arabia could be courted to become yet another country to sign on to the so-called Abraham Accords. This would have been seen as a major win for the United States, ostensibly for Israel, to bring the largest of the Gulf states on board with this particular initiative. And we saw that there were statements that were being made from Riyadh saying that, yes, we would consider doing so if we received assistance on our civilian nuclear program. Well, while it seems that the United States and Israel were chewing on that, it seemed at the very same time there were negotiations underway with Beijing, and the Saudis felt that they received an adequate and a satisfactory deal by cutting it with China and normalizing relations with not Israel, but in fact with Iran.
But do you think that maybe the BRICS played a part because both Saudi and Iran have applied for the BRICS, and it's almost felt like China was saying, if you want to join us, you have to get along. It's showing that this also Algeria is applied to join the BRICS. So I feel like the way it looks now is 3 Muslim countries applied, other countries like Indonesia, Turkey, there was a few more, UAE even, and a few other Muslim countries have shown interest. I think Nigeria recently as well now. It could be.
So when you're talking about the BRICS, of course, you're talking about this what started off at the core with Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
Yeah.
I suppose what we could see the BRICS as being is in some ways how back during the Cold War we used to talk about the movement of non-aligned states, the whole idea of the so-called third world. And with no real coincidence, we're talking about countries that were by and large marginalized and in some ways demonized throughout the Cold War because there was a demand that they take sides and particularly align themselves with the Western alliance. I think that may have something to do with it, but I'm not really sure if there's the need for the formalization of the acronym to then include Saudi Arabia and all, because remember, the geostrategic relationships already exist with BRICS nations. Russia and Saudi Arabia have had a very sustained relationship, especially more recently with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman over oil. Russia has certainly been interested in Saudi oil production and output and regulating the amount of production by the barrel. With the crisis in the Ukraine and with the sanctions that Russia has had to cope with, it is certainly advantageous for Russia to have the price of oil high in order to then offset what may be the economic impact that the war is having on it. Of course, what we find now is that the price of oil is actually going down. Now oil is trading at roughly $65 a barrel. At the same time, Russia has been successful in circumventing sanctions when it comes to putting its oil on the market with the help of countries like India, which have been refining it, which creates, of course, a very sticky situation for the West. On the one hand, the United States and the UK are actively courting New Delhi and the Modi regime, willing to overlook the policies of Hindutva, willing even to overlook the policies of suppressing the press, including the flagship BBC, for its broadcasting of a documentary that was critical of Modi when he was chief minister of the Gujarat in 2002 with the pogroms against Muslims. So the Saudis already have a very robust relationship with New Delhi. They have a robust relationship with Moscow. They have a robust relationship with Beijing. Over the last couple of years, China has in fact been helping develop Saudi Arabia's civilian nuclear program. So what this has really shown is that the trust dividend between Riyadh and Beijing has certainly grown. There already was a trust dividend between Tehran and Beijing with the pledge that China made to invest $400 billion over the next 25 years in Iran's infrastructure. So when you have two parties who may not necessarily see eye to eye with one another, at the very least, having trust in what is now seen as, perhaps for the first time in the Middle East, an honest broker in the form of China is a welcome change. and one that both Tehran and Riyadh have clearly shown that they're receptive to having that kind of trilateral negotiation.
So it's true when you say honest broker. I think when you look at the US and Russia, they've got more involved in the actual politics, whilst China traditionally, like in Africa, I think we've seen that they like to stay out of the politics themselves and work with whoever. So I think that might be appealing to a lot of Arab countries in particular at the moment, and to Iran and perhaps Turkey. I was just wondering, do you think that this deal might, because there's seen almost like the three regional powers of Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey was kind of in the middle of the two. Do you think Turkey will feel isolated by this deal?
On the contrary, I think that Turkey will see itself as having now an equal role in the shaping of the Middle East. And we see this with a renewed rapprochement between Ankara and Riyadh. Saudi Arabia has, in fact, injected some much needed capital into the Turkish economy. The Turkish inflation rate is quite high. It also suffers from an enormous debt incurment. And so the very idea then that President Erdogan is willing to accept Saudi funding is in and of itself rather remarkable. Turkey has now acquiesced to the fact that it cannot handle things by itself, that it cannot rely upon its own self-reliance, that the situation is dire enough that it needs more friends, not fewer friends. And also the fact that Turkey is geographically positioned where it is. It is not an energy producer by itself, but it is certainly an energy conduit. Makes it arguably as important strategically as those countries around it, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, that produce it. So I think that all of these dynamics move toward two new realities. One is the fact that the Middle East, nearly 100 years after its last major shaping after World War I, is being reshaped. And in many ways with both its own agency in doing so, as well as that of new actors in the region. I mean, if you think about how momentous this is, only a few years ago, Russia did not have much of a direct presence within the Middle East. It was certainly an arms supplier to countries like Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, but it really didn't have quote unquote boots on the ground. Since the debacle of the Syria crisis, now we find Russia is directly and physically present both with its naval base at Latakia as well as its Air Force base. And it is an undeniable influence and presence that has to be contended with in the region. And then, of course, seemingly out of nowhere, this dark horse of China coming in, which brings us to the second reality. The erosion of American influence in the region. You know, at one time before 1979, the United States was really the broker with Tehran and with Riyadh. In fact, then President Richard Nixon called Saudi Arabia and Iran the twin pillars of American foreign policy in the region, meaning the Persian Gulf. And both Riyadh and Tehran were eligible to purchase any non-nuclear weapons in the American arsenal. How things have really changed over the last 50 years, where now even a so-called stalwart ally like Saudi Arabia is no longer one that sees Washington as its sole benefactor, its sole protector. 90 years of a relationship which was forged starting in 1932 has now changed, where Saudi Arabia has moved more to the center and is seeing itself open for business from sources that do not only emanate from the West.
So, with the Egypt is now talking as well with Turkey. I just saw this. I think this morning I was reading that they're having these discussions. They're two of the biggest backers of the two governments in Libya, which makes me wonder whether these discussions could also go some way to bringing peace with Libya. We're starting to see in Syria, it's bringing people together. Syria's starting to normalize relations with a lot of Arab governments. I feel like this probably plays a part with the Iran Saudi going on behind the scenes and Turkey as well getting involved. So do you think it's likely that we could see peace and even elections in Libya anytime soon?
And you know what?
Oh, go ahead, please.
Sorry, Doctor, just before you go on, I had a quick question that Hussein, I think it links so well to yours. It would be great if you could answer them both together. But with what you said before, with America being the broker, and how the American superpower is clearly diminishing now, how exactly is that going to change when it's pretty much all we know in the near past, at least?
Well, there's a couple of things going on. First, if you permit me, regarding the situation of whether this deal will create a domino effect toward greater diplomacy
Mm,
and a shift away from war. I think that there's every likelihood of that happening. On the more proximate, I think that optimism is there for Yemen, and we're already starting to see small changes there, which could ameliorate the situation. The fact that Bashar al-Assad is now traveling and is being received
mm,
in the capitals of many Arab states, which were responsible until fairly recently in seeking his ouster and his demise within Syria, is rather momentous. And as you said before, with Egypt and with Turkey, having
mm,
a rapprochement, which may then spill over in changing the landscape, so to speak, politically and otherwise in Libya. What I think we're seeing then is a recognition that proxy wars are not very helpful. And
mm,
particularly given the kind of economic dire straits in which countries like Turkey and Egypt find themselves, the idea then of actually funding, supporting wars elsewhere is something that perhaps for Egypt is not as critical of an issue because Sisi has a strong hold on power there. But for somebody like Erdogan, who is up for re-election in 2 months, these issues are, of course, going to be front and center when it comes to the Turkish public,
mm,
saying that we have a myriad domestic issues and challenges, and you are seemingly diverting attention by supporting a situation in Libya. What does that have to do with the price, literally, of bread and basic staples in Turkey? So that idea then of civil society making that inquiry of both Erdogan and Sisi factors into why then proxy wars are something that are hardly a luxury or an indulgence, and let alone a necessity for these countries. When you ask the question, Sister Fatima, about what does it then mean regarding the American presence and its decline, I would be hard pressed to see anybody in the United, or I should say, in the region, that is necessarily lamenting that, with the possible exception, of course, of Israel, and more so because Israel is now having not only its internal and domestic political issues going on with the Netanyahu government seeking judicial overhaul, and the fact that the internal debate within Israel is really asking the question about whether its democratic institutions can hold firm, but also then wondering what is Israel's positionality within the broader Middle East. After all, 3 years ago, it was with a tremendous amount of optimism that Israel brought forth, with, of course, the Trump administration's involvement,
mm,
the Abraham Accords, bringing the United Arab Emirates and bringing Bahrain into an open and formal recognition of diplomatic ties. It had always been suspected that the UAE and Bahrain had de facto relations with the state of Israel. Now it was out in the open. And there had certainly been a tremendous amount of anticipation and, dare I even say, obsession and expectation that Saudi Arabia would follow suit. And I find it really interesting that it happened now, because there was a certain kind of rationalization that was occurring in Israel and in other quarters, including the United States, that perhaps what was the stumbling block, what was the obstacle for the Saudis to join the Abraham Accords was actually King Salman. Himself in his mid-80s, infirmed, possibly even suffering from dementia, that his son, the future king, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, he has been waiting to join the Abraham Accords. He has been seeking to normalize relations with Israel, and he is just biding his time that once his father passes, that he will then do this. The fact that this deal was memorialized under King Salman is undeniably a rebuke of the architecture of the Abraham Accords. And I'm sure that right now in Jerusalem, Prime Minister Netanyahu, along with all of the other things that are on his head and on his plate, is probably wondering, how could this happen? How could I misread this? How come I'm shocked by it? Because all of that rather bellicose language of threatening Iran, trying to go ahead and isolate Iran by bringing all the Gulf states on side, that seems to have evaporated. Or at the very least, it seems as though the Abraham Accords 3 years on is not living up to what certain expectations were, at least from the West.
So you said earlier that you were just in Baku. It feels
Yes.
like every time we're having looking into geopolitics, something good happens, like this deal, and then suddenly there's a new tensions boiling up. We've been hearing the last week about Azerbaijan and Iran having tensions over the border. Was there any sense of that in Azerbaijan, or is that just something the media is playing up at the moment?
It seems as though it's really more of something that the media is contriving. And part of that has to do with the fact that 3 years on, the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh has certainly tilted in favor of Azerbaijan. And what, as we are talking about surprising negotiations here, it probably caught a lot of people, at least on the surface, by surprise that Russia, in brokering that ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan, was an honest broker, or at least a neutral broker in that particular thing. This really represents a departure from what was, at least traditionally and historically, a favoring of Yerevan by Moscow, traditionally Christian communities. But here we find that the realities and the practicalities of geopolitics stepped in. Russia having an alignment with an oil and natural gas rich Azerbaijan, recognizing that Azerbaijan is also a conduit between Russia and Iran. So the idea of then trying to make an antagonistic narrative between Baku and Tehran doesn't really fit the script. It seems as though it would be illogical for this to be a moment where tension and conflict would emerge between these two countries.
You know, I have a really quick question actually regarding that mindset with Hussein instantly thought, you know what, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And we are programmed in a way to think that, right? Because human rights in our head, it's been changed to this kind of unreachable idea.
So what I would say to that kind of comment is that I think we're often kind of seeing that that negative kind of news out there a lot, that human rights is problematic, there's something going on, there's something quite negative. I think there is something positive in there. I don't think we're so much in a case of one step forward, two steps back. I'd say we're more in a case of we're kind of taking one step forward, but then we're not taking 10 steps back. We're realizing that there's still like so many more steps in front of us, because the field of human rights, there's a lot of change that needs to happen. There's a lot of decolonial narratives that need to be present in these conversations. Oftentimes when I'm studying, we kind of come across something and we're talking about the negatives of it all the time. I think there are positives. I think in human rights, you can see that there's a lot of groundwork that is already existent,
Yeah.
and building on it is what we have to do. In terms of the whole, how do we kind of, in terms of like the Middle East and such, I think we kind of look at human rights through a very westernized perspective. So I've often made this argument that, if you look at human rights, it's made by the West, it's made by Europe, it's made by their standards. If we were to kind of take human rights and apply it to the Middle East, apply it to those kind of standards, there's already things like the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. And we kind of look into those kind of decolonial narratives and decolonial kind of studies on human rights, we might be able to find the steps forward that we need.
I think also,
I don't know
if we're thinking about Israel, right? They must be looking at this deal thinking, oh crap, this isn't looking good for us. And then, in terms of what their vision of human rights, or, what they want to call human rights, this doesn't align with that. So would it ever be the case, and Dr. Saeed Khan, if you want to like jump in with this as well, would it ever be the case that a deal like this could be fully accepted?
When you ask fully accepted, I mean, do you mean by the international community, or?
Well, I think the international community,
who are you asking?
It would be difficult, but for
Right.
example, even in for example, Iran, you've got so many people that understand, the revolution may be better for the country, or have been better for the country, and going forward it's better than what it would have been, and so on and so forth. But within the country there's so much there's dispute with that. So is there dispute within BRICS as well?
To the question as well, because when you say fully accepted in Iran as well, it makes me think the idea was to spread the Islamic revolution.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, like the Shah was, like Iran was under the Shah. Do you think Iran will accept this now as this is how it's going to be, the relationship, and it sort of shows a change in foreign policy of trying to spread the revolution? Do you think they've given up on that, or they can
right? I think in some ways we're framing the question imprecisely when it comes to this idea of acceptance. It is what it is. And I'm not sure that if we are wondering whether there are going to be dissenting voices to exploit, especially those from outside the region, if that is really a reality or an eventuality to have happen. When we look at this particular deal, there is a word that oftentimes gets lost in this, and that's pragmatism. Now, when it comes to the Saudis, well, let's take Iran first, because I think that's perhaps the easier explanation. Their level of skepticism, their level of suspicion, their level of cynicism of Western intervention, of course, goes all the way back to even predating the revolution, to the time of the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. So this isn't, to borrow a very American term, their first time at the rodeo to understand then what's going on. They have, in fact, in many ways, developed their understanding of their relations, their positionality with the West, with, unfortunately, quite a few adverse experiences. But at the same time, Iran has something that the West doesn't fully understand either, and that is the culture of a civilizational arc which goes back thousands of years. Even if one hears Iranian leaders today, whether it is former President Hassan Rouhani, former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, former President Mohammad Khatami, having heard all three of them speak in person, I'm always stunned by their invocation of a 2.5 millennium long historical arc, one that predates the revolution, one that predates even Islam, to include within that the period of the Zoroastrians going all the way back to the Achaemenid dynasty. There aren't that many civilizations that can make that claim to speak in terms of 4 digits. Certainly, the United States cannot. I mean, it's only a tenth of the age of Iranian civilization. Who else has that? Well, China does for sure. Russia
brings out a lot, I think.
Exactly. And so as a result of it, they see this in terms contextually of a broader historical arc and will accept it as being something that is within their strategic best interests, along with, of course, seeing how it's going to affect in the short term. Now, Saudi Arabia, I think, provides a little bit more of an intriguing idea. A country which is very, very young, if you think about it, really only about 90 years old. This year marks the 90th anniversary of the relationship between the Standard Oil Company and Saudi Arabia. The country may have become a kingdom in 1932, but it really became a nation in 1933 with the founding of Aramco. That's when people really started to care, it seems, certainly in the West. And here, all of a sudden, what seems to be all of a sudden, a pivot of such dramatic proportions, Riyadh knowing fully well that the rhetoric between Washington and Beijing is perhaps at an all-time high of antagonism. Here in the United States, you would think that the country is preparing for war against China. I mean, a spectacularly stupid idea, by the way. But still, the complicity of mainstream media in its efforts to demonize China is an everyday occurrence. Making certain false suppositions has become a cottage industry over here. But Saudi Arabia recognizes that perhaps the potency of the United States is not what it once was. They have recognized, I mean, it's no accident that we're talking about this on the literally the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. That was a telling moment for Iran. It was a telling moment for Saudi Arabia and really for the whole world, that this rather vainglorious campaign of acting like cowboys was going to go ahead and be doomed. As we see the wreckage left behind in Iraq, a devastation of a country, devastation of a civilization there. And Saudi Arabia took notice. They took notice that the United States would gladly and easily throw under the bus, so to speak, a loyal ally in the form of Mubarak in Egypt. And I'm not trying to defend Mubarak or anything, but the idea that the relationship between Washington and Cairo was one that within the blink of an eye, when the Arab Spring came 12 years ago, the United States was willing to look the other way as Mubarak was given his exit papers. That sent a shockwave around the Gulf, and Riyadh was very prickly to this idea, thinking if they can do that to Mubarak, who's to say that they won't then abandon the House of Saud? And so the Saudis then decided to tack away and see who else might be willing to strike a deal. Now, with the Trump administration, it seemed as though it was the last real opportunity for the Saudis to engage in a robust way with an American administration. With Biden, we saw, of course, that this has not been the case over the last 2.5 years, and there is no certainty and there's no confidence in the American project being one where the Saudis want to put all of their resources. This may be a moment where, for the meantime, Saudi Arabia straddles the fence between East and West, the United States and China, but it seems as though all indications are that the trajectory are now that the Saudis would rather face the direction in which the sun rises than the direction in which the sun is setting.
I like that last
I
line.
wanna, yeah. I
Quite
just
nice.
want to add on, but Fatima, you were saying how like Israel would be scared of this peace talk. I actually think it's not actually something they might fear, and I would say you'd have to look at history. Going back to like the Cold War era, there was the Tashkent Declaration, where Russia actually led a discussion between India and Pakistan, and the US actually praised it. But when you look at it, it's now simply a footnote in history. It doesn't have, it's not held in high regard. It's not talked about really. And I think only time can actually tell us whether this peace deal itself is going to be a replication of history, or if it is going to be something that Israel is going to be scared of.
No, I think it's for me it seems like biggest deal in the last 10 years that we've seen. It's actually very exciting times. Again, whether it holds and is another thing, but I think that doesn't take away whether, just because it's not being mentioned much in the press, in the Western press at all, and they've tried to downplay it. I don't think that takes away from how important this is and how many deals are being made now with various countries around the Middle East who are allies. We've seen a new deal with Saudi Arabia and Ansar Allah this week. I think it was this week or last week, which obviously this played a large part in it. Even Bahrain is talking with Iran. Some Iranians might see that as or some Bahraini Shias might see that as a bit of a betrayal by Iran. But there is sort of rapprochement going on there. So I think it's a huge thing. I was just wondering whether they came out with this deal with Ukraine and Russia that was straight away dismissed by the West. However, Zelensky's agreed himself to speak to Xi Jinping. Do you think this deal now could encourage a similar deal with Russia and Ukraine?
Absolutely. I mean, I think nothing breeds success like success. And here we see the fact that the kind of resistance to the deal, of course, is being spun as saying that it's really not a deal, it's a ceasefire, and allows Russia to so-called get away with it. I'd remind people that World War I ended not with a peace deal initially, it ended with an armistice. It ended with a ceasefire on November the 11th of 1918. It wasn't until June the 28th of 1919 that the Treaty of Versailles was signed. So chronologically, it seems as though it follows logic that a ceasefire precedes a peace deal. It's interesting that in the Paris Peace Conference, Germany itself was not invited to the table. And here I think what we find is a certain level of envy and frustration that this peace deal will most likely go through without the usual suspects sitting around the table. Mind you, they will still be in the earpiece of Zelensky, and they will still be trying to influence him to say, hold out, we can help strike a deal. But no matter how resilient Ukraine may appear to be, and no matter how tenacious they are, no one experiences what it feels like to be at war than the country where the bombs are actually falling. So for the United States and for other countries, the moral hazard is different. And so it becomes very convenient for them to say, you know, do this and do this, when it's not their blood and treasure that is being affected. I would suspect that Zelensky is going to have to make a deal of some kind. I think that Russia is going to have to compromise. What I see is that some of the status quo will be maintained, meaning that Russia will retain, as it has for the last 9 years, control over the Crimean Peninsula. They may get Mariupol, but I don't think that all of the areas that are under Russian authority now at the expense of Ukraine will remain so. What we see is the Chinese model, which is very, very important to understand, is that they always operate based on one of the priorities being to have both sides save face. This is very much a Chinese conceit, and you see that that is what they're trying to do, so that Putin can claim a victory of some kind, and so can Zelensky. That is not something that really is within the Western pathology. It oftentimes becomes winner take all, and the side which is determined and defined to be the aggressor or the one in the wrong is then punished. And if history has taught us ever anything, it is that that kind of categorical punishment always has a consequence. This is what happened after the Treaty of Versailles, with the punitive measures that were placed on Germany, then leading to a Second World War. China doesn't operate with that, and China is not necessarily looking for Xi Jinping to go to Oslo next year to win a Nobel Prize. They operate off other metrics. For them, it's about business. For them, it's about global influence. And here they are showing their rather sophisticated and skillful way of achieving both.
Thank you so much for that. And I think I really do think we need a part 2.
Okay, anytime.
I think I have so many more questions after that, just because obviously the Treaty of Versailles and history and the way it may be repeating itself in some ways. It's such a deep topic.
I think it would be good if we return to it maybe in a few months and just see what's held or whatnot. You know.
We'll see if Ukraine and Russia finally have peace.
I really am so excited to see what Zelensky decides to do.
Who knows? Maybe he'll change into a suit. But no, any time I would love to come back. These are fantastic topics, so thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you so much.
We really appreciate your contribution. You really teach us a lot.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Kaneez, as well. Not just for coming onto this episode, but for working behind the scenes. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you would like to see us part 2 of this, do let us know. You can contact us on our Instagram, DM us, let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear them. And thank you so much for tuning in. See you soon, inshallah.